Hi, and welcome to Academic Compliance Academy. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what is de-risking, the concept of de-risking. I put out here two definitions, both focusing on the financial world, but I will give examples of de-risking also actually being a concept that everyday people use and have to comprehend when they are going around in the world. But let's focus on something concrete here. The World Bank defines de-risking as a situation where global financial institutions are increasingly terminating or restricting business relationship with remittance companies or smaller local banks in certain regions of the world. So why do they do this? They do it because they pose a higher risk. So here, de-risking is the action of limiting risk, not because something is necessarily wrong, but simply because it is harder to control. There is a higher risk. The further away from your core business you go, the higher the risk is. FATF, the Financial Action Task Force Against Money Laundering, has a slightly different definition. So they say de-risking refers to the phenomenon of financial institution terminating or restricting business relationship with clients or categories of clients to avoid rather than manage risk in line with the risk-based approach. So here we see the essence, to avoid rather than manage. So when we talk about de-risking, it's actually a limitation of risk rather than looking at the risk and trying to handle the risk. But what drives this behavior? Well, Oxfam in 2015 came up with 5 key drivers. So this is going to be from a company view. I'm going to do it from a personal view afterwards. But let's just see here. So in general, we have a perception of risk being bad. And is that always the case? Well, as a company, you need to take risk. You cannot be 100% sure all the time, which means that even though you're taking risk, this is also part of business operations. You cannot just avoid risk. So you need to grasp that the perception of risk is not that it's always bad. It also comes with a chance of succeeding, a chance of capitalization, a chance of growing. But of course, every time you step out of your comfort zone, every time you expose yourself to more risk, every time you want to take a chance, well, you expose yourself to more risk, and they're kind of connected, both of them. So you need to see, is this a risk really bad, or is it just risk that we need to manage or mitigate? The second driver is client profitability, and that is, of course, that you tend to de-risk, you tend to limit your risk, because clients that are high risk are posing you with a higher cost too, because you need to monetize them more, you need to control them. Just imagine that you have a corporation that has to collaborate with someone else. Okay, if this trade partner has a high risk, if you're really insecure in that relationship, you need to monitor them much more, because you might be insecure if they want to steal from you, if they want to take out some company secrets and profit on them by themselves. So whenever you have a client or a trade partner that expose you to higher risk, well, they also expose you to a higher cost function. So thereby, if you de-risk, if you limit them, well, you tend to earn more money. But then again, we have to look back at the perception of risk, because if you never expose yourself to risk, your profit margin over time might, well, decrease. So the third point here is increased compliance costs. So a lot of companies, especially in highly regulated fields like finance, well, they have tend to de-risk it, because there's after the financial crisis, we saw a boom within the European Union and all over the world of financial regulation, which means that every time you have a client, you have a bunch of regulation that you need to comply to, hence compliance costs. So it's not only client profitability. But on top of that, you have regulation that induces cost on each client, and the higher the risk, the higher the cost. The fourth driver of de-risking is the fear of sanction. If you do not comply with regulation or in accordance with the risk-based regime, well, you are in fear of sanctioning. And that, of course, is not a good thing. It's not an incentive to drive businesses if you constantly fear some kind of fine, imprisonment, or etc. So thereby you want to limit yourself from the risk, again, de-risk, so the behavior turns always towards de-risking. And the last one is reputational risk. No one wants to be the one who gets famous of taking the wrong risks. So all of these drivers tend to force companies to having a de-risking behavior. So take it from a personal view. Every person also sees this. If you have a friend or a co-worker that you have an insecure relationship with, well, you tend also to need to control them more, monitor them more, and this induces a cost that you need to bear to succeed. So you can see it from a company point of view, but you can also see it as a personal thing. People tend to de-risk. So why is it, or is it actually bad to de-risk? Well, this is very hard because there are some consequences of de-risking. And the consequences we see in society is that you kind of exclude high-risk customers or clients from the financial sector or other social constructs. And that's not necessarily bad because they're high risk, but it's not necessarily good because you as a person might be a high-risk customer in certain areas. But that doesn't mean that you're bad. So just limiting people for having higher risk, limiting companies, limiting client for their high risk is not an excuse per se. You need more if you need to argue that you're complying and de-risking is actually good in this case. So de-risking just as a concept, excluding high risk, cannot be a satisfying argument when you want to comply to example regulation. Because the consequence is that you force them to use other means or resources. If we talk about clients being excluded from the financial sector, well, you force them to use other means of financial services, which might come from the shadow economy or even the underground economy, and we do not want that because then we're excluding them from the actual legitimate sector and forcing them away, supporting the like illegit behavior, and that is not in favor of society. Furthermore, if we think of de-risking and more company based, when we de-risk, we limit trade, we limit interaction, and everyone knows that the basic line for prosperity in economics is trade. So by limiting the interaction, limiting the trade, well, we limit the positive effects, spillover effects that might come from that, which increase our economy. The last one is just putting the outline out. The thing that we need to balance is we tend to, with de-risking behavior, we tend to enhance exclusion rather than look at inclusion, which diversity is all about and where we can see that there are some profitability by inclusion. So we need to, when we need to figure out how to comply with de-risking, we need to figure out where the line is between exclusion and inclusion. So this was just a short video on the concept of de-risking, the consequences, and what we need to think about when we just talk about de-risking. Stay tuned, subscribe to this channel, and let us share more knowledge.